third category that we can define. Take the United States first. The United States, of course, had a competition law from the 1890s, and many of you know something about that. The United States has been at the center of the discussion the entire time. And of course, even today, the United States plays a dominant role in many parts of these international processes. Interestingly enough, however, the American officials and oh, it wasn't working. So nobody heard anything I said. Okay. Well, whatever you didn't hear, I'm not going to repeat. So that's it. Anyway, so again, the main point is the U.S. If the U.S. is a major player, well, it ought to be important to analyze pretty clearly what the United States experience has been and how it affects how the United States officials and writers and commentators portray the world, how they think about the world, right? They're going to be the ones that have a lot of influence on, if someone has a lot of influence on me, I would like to know what's influencing them, right? I want to know what's affecting them. Why do they think this way? Why do they think about me the way they think about me? Right? And to understand that, you need to think about what kind of experience you've had. And so the book looks at this at a brief level, in a brief way, and tries to ask these kinds of questions. How does it affect the perceptions by American? This doesn't work either.
No, you have to talk a little bit closer.
A little bit closer. Okay.
Yes.
How much? No, I won't ask. I won't ask how much you haven't heard. In any event, the idea is to try to tie these together, as I said. So we look a little bit at the development in the United States, and here there's just one piece of it that's important to mention. Right now, the American officials, the American scholars, the American judges accept the proposition that competition law is just about a particular use of economics, a particular goal of economics, a particular goal of competition law, and a specific kind of economics. That wasn't always the case. In fact, it wasn't the case, and many people believe that, well, that's just the American way of doing things. It wasn't at all that way until starting in the 1970s. Until then, there were much broader notions. Competition law was designed and sold to the people in the country, not as some technical economic issue, but as an important political, social, and economic issue. That's how it got support, political support. And we're always asking the question about interests. If competition law is going to be effective, it needs support from the leaders, but even more so from the interests behind the leaders, which might be consumers, might be small producers, might even be some larger producers in some situations. So we're always asking, well, where is that support coming from? Right? And for a long time in the United States, it wasn't coming from a technocratic notion of competition law. It was coming from a notion that competition law played a bigger role. It changed in the United States for reasons that may be relevant for other countries. Sometimes I think are relevant for other countries. It may not be so relevant for some other countries. It changed largely because the American academic establishment in the area, American economists began to argue competition law, if it has too many goals and it operates on the basis of a case law system. The United States model is entirely case-based. There's one substantive statute that was enacted in 1890, which says nothing and hasn't changed. All right, so it's all about cases. The decisions of federal judges who usually know nothing about international anything. Right? Occasionally they do, but not often. But one thing they did know in the 1890s, that the economists and others told them, is that if you have a competition law that's not well enough defined, it isn't clear enough, it's based on a variety of cases dealing with all kinds of goals, you're going to have a lot of burdens on your economy that you probably don't want, that aren't useful burdens on your economy. So that they changed the way of thinking about competition law and narrowed the goals tremendously and focused specifically on economic goals and on particular kinds of economic goals. Many people are not aware of the amount of that change. Institutionally, the changes have not been great in the United States, but substantively, they've been enormous. And so it's critical to understand that experience, because that helps to understand why American officials take certain decisions. At the ICM that you referred to a little while ago, a couple of years ago, a former FTC commissioner pleaded to the ICN people, all the 750 or whatever there, don't make the same mistakes that the Americans made, that we made, he said. We understand that the only way to have competition law be effective is to have a particular kind of economics and limit it to that. And he said, the reason is because of our experience. We've tried other things, and they haven't worked. Well, he's a good friend of mine, so I can, never mind. One thing he didn't say was that the experience in the United States is based entirely on case law development, which may not be necessarily relevant to other countries. But there's clearly benefit in looking at some of those experiences and reasoning why the use of economics in a particular way can be very, very beneficial. But also to keep it in the context of understanding, well, under some circumstances, maybe one would keep thinking about how that could be varied, how it might be important to have some modification of that in some kinds of situations. The main point here is just to say, thinking about the experience in the United States tells us an awful lot about why the American officials, why the American writers say what they say, write what they say. We can then, once we recognize that, we can evaluate whether we want to do it ourselves, whether you want to do it yourself, other people want to do it. But if you don't know that, well, it's a little hard to make an informed decision about what they're telling you. Right? So that's, I think, not important. But also, look at the idea of the American model. Many people in the world say that the US is the central model for competition. Not everybody. Lots of people don't agree with that, of course. But many people would say that well, if there is a model, it has to be the United States, because it can't be anything else. Then you have to, well, why do people think that? What leads them to think that, and what do they think they see? If everyone says, well, the United States is the model, but everyone has a different understanding of what the model is, it's not going to lead to any improvement. Right? And I've seen enormous differences around the world, from China to Europe to other places. People saying this about the United States model, and that about the United States model, and God knows what about the United States model, and all of it often, at least in part, very wrong. So one needs to be more clear about exactly what one's doing. And if we start thinking about the relationship, is a normal way of thinking about this. How does national relate to international? Then we tend to get beyond that, right? We tend to ask the questions that are important to get beyond that point. What about Europe? Europe is the second most important player in this picture. And there are huge misconceptions about Europe. If you talk to American officials and many people, American scholars and officials and everybody, and a lot of other people around the world, they say, well, competition law came to Europe after the Second World War because the Americans imposed their US antitrust law, and yes, it spread in Europe from there. Total nonsense. utter ridiculous nonsense based on lack of knowledge. I spent about 6 or 8 years of my life documenting that in an earlier book, which many people in Europe seem to be very grateful for. Because what turns out is that back in the even in the 1890s, a different conception of competition law was developing in Europe. At the time, and for another 30 years or 40 years, the Europeans thought the American version of antitrust law is stupid. They rejected it totally. They were developing their own sense of competition law. It was a model, and oversimplifying, of course, but two basic ideas. One basic idea, it starts with the problem of power, economic power. If you have some very intelligent people in Austria and Germany thinking about these problems because economic problems were dramatic. And they said, well, if the economy represents a system, right, and power interferes with the system, then we have to try to reduce, or can interfere with the system, and we have to reduce the degree to which that power interferes with the system. Because to the extent it interferes with the system, it harms the capacity of the system to provide benefits. That was the starting point, and in some senses is still true. In some parts of European competition law, still true. Okay, so it developed for a long time in Europe, this notion. On the institutional procedural side, in dramatic contrast to the United States, things were left to the administrators, just as they are in Colombia and in most of the world. You don't leave these decisions in most of the world to judges. You leave them to administrators. And that's what the European tradition has always been. It's changing a little bit at the edges, but not very much. So, main point being that Europe has its own tradition, its own approach. So what has happened in recent years is worth then taking into account. In the 1990s, Europeans began to say, well, if the Europeans were then trying very hard to emulate the economic success of the United States. You have to remember the 1990s, things were going very well, most of the 1990s anyway, in the United States, the last part of the 1990s. And the Europeans said, we want to do that too. And what did the Americans do, they said? Well, the Americans made their competition law more strictly based, more based on economics. So let's do that same thing. This is what the European Commission starts doing. Lots of other factors involved, but this is an oversimplified version. But that's largely the center of it. And so began moving large parts of the competition law toward that kind of substantive approach. Doesn't change the procedural institutional issues, but in terms of substance in areas of cartels, in vertical relationships, you began to say, let's do it basically the way the American economic approach calls for. Okay? The area where that has not changed, where the former economic power orientation has not changed, is abuse of dominance. Right? The notion of abuse of dominance is still in Europe very much a battle contest between economic ideas and somewhat broader notions of what should happen in terms of economic power. So Europe moved, in some senses, not institutionally, but substantively, toward the US model. This led many people to say, well, many people in other parts of the world to say, well, the Europeans are emulating the Americans, maybe we should do the same thing. But often that wasn't based on very clear understanding of what was actually changing and some of the factors for the change and of the difficulties of some of the changes. So for purposes of analysis, we want to ask, okay, what was leading to that change? What effects has it had? One of the things that's been a big problem in Europe, might be relevant to Colombia because you have the same sort of institutional system, is that the European Commission and certain administrators say it should be about economics, but the judges involved who review what they do often are very reluctant to follow that idea. And there are major issues with proof, all kinds of issues that come up in the context of an administrative model, such as one has in Colombia also, that the Americans never have, because they have basically a different model of litigation and a different model of procedure. So there's much to learn, I think, from European experience if one is in developing competition law in a country like Colombia, because there's some institutional background. Okay, so that's, again, the basic idea. If we think about it national, international, how do the two keep relating? These give you, these are a few comments that suggest some important issues there. The last group of countries is a group of many different kinds of countries. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but a couple of things just to mention. One is that if you look at these various countries, including China and Japan and Korea and all the others, right, that have a significant role, you find that one sort of fact stands out. If competition law doesn't serve the needs of the decision makers and usually also of large segments of the population, although the last part is not so clear sometimes, it's not going to be at all successful. But one case in point, Japan. Japan had a competition law imposed after the Second World War by the Americans, the occupation, and they had a statute. Fine, a statute did nothing for 50 years. Just didn't enforce it. Americans could tell us to have a statute, but they couldn't enforce it. So they just forgot about it. Only in the 1990s, when the Japanese said competition law serves our interests, did they start getting serious about it. They began to say this is good for, first of all, for Japanese consumers, but also even for Japanese businesses who have to understand these kinds of issues, have to deal with the kinds of problems that are going to be faced around the world. They said, let's get serious. And so they dramatically increased the enforcement of competition law in Japan. Somewhat similar situation in Korea and elsewhere. So again, the point being, better make sure if you're trying to develop a competition law that you know the sources of potential support, because otherwise it might not work the way you want it to work. China is a point to mention that many people aren't aware of. It's something that I pay a fair amount of attention to. Again, I mentioned before that the notion of China being a big player in this area is very new. Right? And if you were developing if you're in Washington, for example, and you're developing a competition law, and you say, well, it's fine to have a unilateral system that basically means we can apply our law, but nobody would dare apply their law to us. Things change if the Chinese say, we've got a competition law too. And we're not afraid of you, my friend. We'll be happy to do this and apply our competition law to your companies. Well, things change. Maybe the jurisdictional system doesn't look as attractive from Washington as it might have before. And some people are beginning to recognize that this is a very serious issue. The Chinese have had a competition law for only 3 years, and they would recognize that they're just getting started in most areas. In mergers, they're getting quite sophisticated and deal very nicely on a global level. Other areas not yet. That's all changing. And as I mentioned, I think, in one context a little while ago, not here, but in another context in Bogota, Chinese government has invested heavily in creating new jobs in universities for teaching competition law. This seemed impossible. Impossible. It still seems impossible to people. Many people don't realize that it's going on, of course, but people say, first of all, they said, it's a communist country, and why should they do that? But they are. They're developing competition law. That I'm told, one of the reasons that I know this is I get so many requests for doctoral students to study with me because they think I can get a good job in China in that area. This is the area where we can get jobs because the government is funding new jobs in competition law around China. In China, in the last 3 years, 5 competition law centers have been created. 3 years ago, there were none. Now there are 5, and they're getting good funding. So China is becoming part of this game that we better not ignore. Okay, so that's just a little bit of thinking about how do these things constantly relate. National always influencing international, international always influencing national. If you think along those lines, I think it helps an enormous amount in trying to figure out what's going on. So the last couple of comments, and I think I have 4 minutes, so I'll try to stay on time. Where does this all go? Everybody who deals with this realizes that the current system has a lot of potential problems. As long as you've got this idea that there are global markets and individual countries control the global markets with different kinds of competition goals, you know that you're creating costs, you're creating uncertainties. Businesses are ever more beginning to say, wait a second, this is costly, this is wasteful, this is nonsense. We've got to do something. Right now, the only strategy that seems to be on the table for most people is the idea of convergence. And convergence can be useful, certainly can be useful, but I think there's a lot of mythology around convergence as well. We have to be careful about it. As specialists in this field, as people dealing with it in some professional way, we need to think about it more carefully. What exactly is this claim about convergence? Often the idea is, oh, there's convergence around the economic model or something. Does anybody know what that means? What's converging? How is it converging? What's causing it to converge? All these issues often are just left in a fog, right? And so one of the things we have to do, and I make some suggestions in the book about, okay, let's be a little more clear about exactly what we're talking about. What are the factors involved in convergence? When can it be useful? To what extent can it be useful? If we do that, then we can use it to our advantage. We can understand it. We can use it to our advantage. If we don't do that, we're talking about fairy tales. We're talking about things that may be going in directions we don't understand. Be like reading Gerber or somebody. You say, oh, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And you just never know what they're talking about. So I encourage that kind of analysis with regard to convergence. The notion that there can be some sort of coordination on a global level has been, since about 2000, has been sort of taken off the table by most. The effort was made by the Europeans in the World Trade Organization in the 1990s to include competition law in the World Trade Organization. The Americans did not support it, and many developing countries turned cold after initially saying they would. Two major factors involved. The Americans basically take the position that we don't want to get involved with competition law with a bunch of other people who may have different ideas about competition law. We have enough power, and the system benefits us using that power to influence what's going on the global market ourselves, dealing with individual countries, dealing with individual organizations. So why should we become part of this kind of a World Trade Organization operation? And the resistance in developing countries was often, I'm told, because African countries in particular said the way the TRIPS agreement, without going into details about the TRIPS agreement, worked, Peter knows I'm sure about this, we got a bad deal. So we're not going to have a competition law because that might create another bad deal that won't give us anything, but might give somebody else something instead. So it has it's been somewhat forgotten, but I think one thing to think about. There's one thing to think about, it seems to me, my last seconds here. The potential for coordination may not be as limited as some people think. As I say, if you look at in the past, there has been a lot of interest and a lot of support for the idea. We are now at a point where we could be much more careful about what kind of an approach might be useful. A notion of a competition code, I think, is not viable. not viable. People ask me this often. Do you think it could be a code? I don't think it can be a code, not now and not anytime soon. That doesn't mean we can't be more creative. In the current world, we've got other ways of doing things. Right? We have networking arrangements. We have various kinds of feedback arrangements where countries could agree on some goals that would allow flexibility, would allow increased use of particular kinds of methods and tools, which might start bringing countries together. If you use economics, for example, as a methodological tool, you can talk about convergence around the use of the tool, which might be very valuable. Right? And so one of the things I encourage in the book is to begin thinking, to begin again thinking about the potential for doing that, but I urge that there be some creative thought in this. Right? That this is not be done in old ruts, but in new forms, and I think that can be done. And I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think that Latin America can play a very important role in all of this, and I hope very much that it does. So thank you very much.
Quinto, conferencia titulada The Role of Law and Case Law in International Trade Relations, a cargo de Peter van der Kolk, profesor de la Universidad Maastricht, miembro del órgano de operación de la Organización Mundial de Comercio.